Well, good afternoon. It's 1 minute past noon Central Time here, so we'll get started because there's a lot we want to talk about and just an hour to do so. As director of the Butcher Center for Peace and Nonviolence here at Central Seminary, I am delighted to be able to welcome you today for this first of our three-part Zoom series on reflections and conversations about American Christianity and gun violence. I do encourage you to mute yourself so as not to disturb others. We are recording this session so that others later who aren't available will be able to watch this. So if you could do that, that would be wonderful. And we will plan to send you a link when it's available so you also can share it if you so want to do. I do invite you to put your name in the chat, your place where you're zooming in from, and if there's any other information briefly you'd like to share, especially if it's related to this topic, feel free to do that. As we go along, if there are questions that you would like us to address or comments that you'd like to make during the last 15 or 20 minutes of the session, please put those in the chat as well. One of us will be monitoring it and bring those into the conversation at a later time. If perchance somehow we get disconnected or there's a rude interruption, in a minute, just log on to that same number and we will just continue forward. During each of these 3 consecutive weeks, we will start with a presentation by the author of the article that you were given to read if you so chose to do so. These reflections will start our conversation about the issue of gun violence with a particular focus on the American Christianity context. From there, we'll have a panel with 2 others joining the presenter and discussing the questions that the article raised for them, as well as larger related issues. And then from there, we'll open up the discussion for you all to join in. So again, in preparation for that larger conversation, we invite you to place questions you'd like to discuss in the chat box. After taking up some of those written questions, if there is time, then we'll move on to questions directly from the audience. We do want to remind you that we are aiming for a civil conversation and dialogue about this controversial topic, in which we may have very diverse perspectives and commitments. We ask that we each be respectful and seek to learn from one another, even as we seek to also solidify and express our own views. Being able to hear one another's voices and learn from one another's reflections and questions will help each of us to gain a deeper understanding of the issues that will be in focus. Now, let me introduce who will be leading these conversations. Our presenter today and author of the article, I Have a Gun and I Know How to Use It, a phenomenology of handgun ownership by evangelical Christians, is Dr. Terrace Roselle. Terry is professor of pastoral theology in the area of ethics in ministry praxis here at Central Seminary, a position he has had since 1999. He also holds the endowed Rosemary Flanagan Chair at the Center for Practical Bioethics. As part of that role, he is a clinical professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Medicine at the University of Kansas School of Medicine and director of the Clinical Ethics Consultation Service at the University of Kansas Health System. Joining him later for the panel discussion will be Dr. David May, who is professor of New Testament here at Central Seminary. He is the Landernau Guillory Chair of Biblical Studies and director of the Master of Arts Theological Studies program. And I also will be joining that panel as an associate professor of pastoral theology emerita. All 3 of us have also served as pastors in mostly Baptist churches before and during the time in which we were faculty members here at Central Seminary. So let's get started with our first presentation. Terry, I am turning the session over to you.
All right. Thank you. And is my audio okay? You're hearing me? Yes. Okay, very good. Thank you. So I will begin with disclosures, which is I have none that are relevant, financial or otherwise, except one. I have a gun and I know how to use it. This is my gun. In a an article that you did not receive that was a very brief article in this journal issue of Review and Expositor that we all, the three of us, participated in. I had a picture, a photo of this work of art that I did as a part of the research I was doing relative to evangelicals and gun culture. I wrote in that description, artist reflections on this work, that I work towards usefulness and or beauty in almost every artistic creation, but this one I find revolting. Each time I gaze at this pistol cross, I feel something in the pit of my stomach. If there were a point to it, perhaps that is it, revulsion. Oh, and I'm having a hard time making my slides move, Ruth. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to see if we can do breakout groups. I don't know that I have the ability to do that, Ruth, so you'd have to, but if you can create breakout groups, I'd like for us to do that just this one time. If you hate breakout groups and webinars, this will be the only one probably that you'll encounter in this series. But as we begin, I'd like for us to move from my monologue immediately to that of a bit of dialogue between you. Responding to one or more of these questions, why did you come to this webinar? What is your relationship to guns and handguns in particular? And how do you respond to this gun cross, this pistol cross in the Christian season of Lent? So if you don't remember all three of those questions, just pick one of them and have a bit of dialogue in breakout groups for about 5 minutes.
Terry, how many people per breakout group?
Probably 4.
4. Okay.
And are we the remaining breakout group?
Tracy is still here.
Okay.
We are a remaining group.
And Tracy could join us if she wanted to.
Yeah.
Hi, Tracy.
Hey, Tracy.
You can just stay with us if you want.
I guess maybe she didn't put that she would leave.
Yeah.
So I didn't quite realize you couldn't do that. Do I need to send a message or can you do that? I made you a co-host, Terry.
I, as co-host, don't have anything on here about groups, breakout groups.
You have to hit more.
Yeah, and I think everybody's in a group now, it looks like.
Oh, yeah, it does look like.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yep.
I see now. All
Yeah.
right.
I put 7 groups, so I think we've got about that.
And did you stop?
Oh, no, I didn't. Pardon? Oh,
rec-
I need to stop that. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you.
So welcome back. I hope you had some good dialogue. And we will have opportunity for that a bit later as well. So if there's something that you want to talk about that came up in your breakout group, we should have opportunity later. So my reflections as the artist created this pistol cross and the clay pottery base that it sits in was that today's handgun strikes me as being what the sword and the executioner's cross was for Jesus' day. And that when the cross was first introduced in places of Christian worship, I suspect that that too must have been shocking and revolting, given that Jesus died on that cross. Over the years, the centuries, the millennia, the cross has become something different, something that we use as jewelry, hang around as a pendant around our neck, or place beautiful crosses on our walls or in our sanctuaries or on the steeple of our places of worship. But initially, it must have been something more like what I feel and experience when I look at this pistol cross, revolting. I also reflect on my own work of art and think of it as an icon, as symbolic. Even as the cross is symbolic, so too the pistol cross may well be iconic, symbolizing what it is that we have given up to follow Jesus. Perhaps even the right to lethal self-defense. Is this so? The primary article and work that I did for this issue of Review and Expositor was a report on phenomenological research that I did. And so I will report on that, looking at my hypotheses, going into the research methods that I used, the activities that I engaged, conclusions that came from analyzing the data, reflecting on it, and then additional hypotheses that my research generated. It started out with hypotheses like this, that I hypothesize that there's a discernible and growing relationship of dependency on handguns within moral communities of American evangelical Christians. I also hypothesized that dependency on handguns as a lethal means of personal protection could be idolatrous and antithetical to the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, I reflecting on this again last night, that may actually be more presumptive than a hypothesis, but I'm leaving it under my list of hypotheses for now. The methods I used were qualitative, not quantitative. I did not seek to produce generalizable knowledge. I was investigating occurrences of something, in this case, evangelical handgun ownership. I hoped to learn from the particularity of the particular contexts in which I entered and listened and paid attention and took notes, asked questions, and then engaged in reflection. I used phenomenological method, which involved immersion, paying attention to that community and communities in which I found myself and placed myself, trying to set aside assumptions so as to see and discern more clearly, engaging in a reflective and a reflexive attitude, including myself as a participant in that context while I was there, and then engaging in what's been referred to as thick description of what is observed and using narrative to do so. So the research activities that this involved was background research, literature review, which I had been doing for a number of years already, conferences. In fact, I put together an all-day conference collaborating with the Center for Practical Bioethics and Kansas City University, the School of Medicine. And this was about 5 or 6 years ago. We did a conference, invited guest speakers in regionally as well as nationally, including a philosopher colleague of mine from back east who teaches in a Christian college and is a philosopher as well as a medical ethicist and a gun owner, avid proponent of gun rights, gun ownership. And so I asked him to present, as well as a researcher from Johns Hopkins University who does quantitative research, primarily collecting data from around the country and drawing conclusions from the data collected. I did field research at a place called Frontier Justice that I will describe. I visited, I observed, I reviewed their website, I interviewed people while I was there. I engaged in some brief email correspondence with one of the owners. I also enrolled in concealed carry gun training, which happened to also be on the premises at Frontier Justice. It was an all-day event. And again, paid attention, took notes, and reflected on that experience and what I had learned and experienced. I interviewed and corresponded with a pastor. I say evangelical with a question mark because he questions whether or not evangelicals would own him anymore, because he is relatively progressive in his thinking. And he also, I interviewed him intentionally because he is a gun owner and an advocate. And I wanted to learn from his perspective, an alum of this seminary. And I'm rather hoping that he logs on to this series and identifies himself. He gave me permission to do so, but I use a pseudonym regardless. I also did research on how to purchase a handgun. I'd never done that before. I bought a gun when I was a teenager, a long time ago, but it wasn't a handgun. And nobody bought handguns that I knew of back then. It was for hunting, and handguns weren't for that purpose. So I did the research online and going to gun stores and pawn shops and learning about gun regulations, how it would have to be done, and ultimately purchased that gun that you saw in the photo of artwork. And that was another activity, is creating something out of the gun that I had purchased and reflecting on it. So my field research was at Frontier Justice, and I'll do some readings from the narrative that we published, starting with this one. The retail outlet is called Frontier Justice and is advertised as, quote, Kansas City's premier firearms, fashion, and shooting range destination. It is a gun store, fashion boutique, training facility, and shooting range. Its marketing clearly targets church people, especially women and families. Quote, at Frontier Justice, our mission is to serve. We do this with a passion driven by our core values and centered on our philosophy of faith, family, and freedom, unquote. I go there as a theological ethicist using phenomenological methods to study the phenomenon of handguns in the hands of American evangelicals. This is field research. Frontier Justice, the store, is all that it claims to be online and more. There are, of course, hundreds of firearms of all sorts and sizes and colors too. Some are clearly designed to appeal to feminine shoppers. Handgun handles come in baby blue, violet, lime green, and hot pink. Most of the inventory here are handguns, but the next most common firearms displayed are assault-style rifles such as the AR-15. I learn about stripped lower receivers, a sort of gun chassis. One has a logo, waterboarding instructor, with settings on that gun chassis that are titled dry, wet, and drown 'em. The clothing boutique is as boho chic as advertised. A savvy shooter must be well attired. One t-shirt warns, "Don't mess with my faith, family, firearms, freedom." Another advises, "Keep calm, carry guns." My favorite thus far reads, "I love Jesus, but I drink a little." The shooting range is impressive and clearly popular with patrons. Ladies' night is every Wednesday from 4 to 7 p.m. when women shoot for free. Kids and families are more prevalent here on Monday evenings when parents and children shoot free. Targets used are mostly humanoid. I am wondering whether someone like me, who does not intend to shoot people, neither with a rented handgun for target practice, nor with one I might buy for purposes of research, wondering if for people like me, we might use the old-fashioned type of target with concentric circles and bullseye. I learned that one can bring one's own target when renting the range. One can also join the Peacemaker Gun Club, which meets here at Frontier Justice. As I browse, background music is playing the praise song, "Here I Come to Worship." Faith symbols are prevalent throughout the store in accordance with stated core values. The Faith, Family, Freedom logo is imprinted everywhere. In the boutique shop is a wall of lovely crosses adjacent to artful American flags. In the jewelry section are cross earrings and pendants. A shirt is emblazoned with the words, "Spoiler alert, the tomb was empty," Luke 24:24. The book section includes one with Bible promises. A wall plaque features a Mother Teresa quotation about kindness. Others have Bible verses. One is from Isaiah 41, verse 10. "Fear not, for I am with you." When I went back to Frontier Justice sometime later, it was for the concealed carry gun training class, which was all day. And I, again, paid attention, took a lot of notes on things other than what was being taught, although that as well. And here are some of my reflections on the concealed carry gun training part of my research. Frontier Justice advertises concealed carry classes. For about $100 plus $15 gun rental, one can receive all the training required in the state of Kansas for a concealed carry permit. So I register online for an all-day class to be held at the gun store on the Saturday before Thanksgiving. It was really quite fascinating. There were 2 white male instructors about my age and 2 other white male trainees, also boomers. The other 10 students appeared to be Gen Xers or millennials, and all apparently white males, but for one young woman and one African-American man. We were together long enough that day so as to recognize most of my peers as the sort of people I knew and mostly loved in every Baptist church I served or attended for the past 45 years. The instructors, too, were overtly faith-based and Christian. One said, by way of introduction, "I am security in my church." It seemed that if I were to hang out with these nice, churchy sort of people for a while longer, their worldview might make sense to me. might make perfect sense. What is it like out there? The world is an increasingly dangerous place. There are many bad guys out there. Good guys with the correct mindset have the right and duty to protect ourselves and families, our churches and communities, and our American way of life by lethal means if necessary. One thing we must do to, quote, look better in court, I was told, one thing we must do is to always use hollow point bullets, except for target practice, of course. The RIP brand of bullet is good, we're told. Quote, hollow point does more damage to a bad guy with just one shot, with less ricochet potential, less bodily penetration, or over penetration. One is taught in those classes to aim not for the head or the heart, but the center mass of your target's body, where all the vital organs are. So your hollow point RIP bullet can do the most bodily damage. The major takeaway was a meme. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Given time and repeated media exposure and ongoing relationships with true believers, I too might become persuaded of its truth. I sensed that I too could be deluded. The class of all men but one was cautioned about having a gun at home and getting into an altercation with your wife or partner. Quote, you need to be cautious because if you get charged with domestic battery, you can lose your right to own a gun. It's just the way it is, folks. Unquote. And my comment, scary indeed. And one final reading from my concealed carry gun training. At Frontier Justice, my evangelical concealed carry instructor matter-of-factly told me, quote, you need to make an informed decision as to whether or not you are willing to look another person in the eye and take their life because you did what you had to do. You got to have that mindset. My comment and reflection, I do not have that mindset. This is research, and I'm learning so much. My third activity was interviewing a pastor. Call him Reverend Ted Halifax, who said to me, I am a firearms collector and heavily involved in the 2A community, Second Amendment rights community. He said, I shoot weekly, about 1,000 rounds per month. I regularly take classes in pistol shooting, including in other parts of the country, going to camps for shooting. Reverend Halifax said that he views a firearm, quote, as a tool or toy. As a toy, he said, it's like a golfer uses a golf club. As a tool, he says, it's to protect someone with lethal force. I asked him about guns in church. He says, I don't carry in the pulpit. Just don't like the idea. Also, I don't have a clear line of fire from up there. Asked him about his church, and he indicated that in church, there are one or more congregants who are always carrying handguns, concealed carry for armed security. The good guys ready to protect the innocent from bad guys. He said that the church had applied for a FEMA grant of $83,000, taxpayer money. And the purpose was to add remotely activated security locks throughout the church building, and to apply ballistic film for the windows on the lower levels throughout the church building. We talked about the statistical likelihood of needing that $83,000 worth of security for his place of worship. And I calculated what the statistical likelihood was, finding data from quantitative research that I found in publications and online. It looks like the chance of any sort of violence in a place of worship per year is approximately 0.14%, which I think is like 1.4 of 1,000 congregations are likely to experience any sort of violence in any given year. That's relatively small. The chance of any sort of violence happening in any congregational meeting per year, and I calculated, let's say 10 meetings per place of worship per week, including choir practice, trustees meetings, council meetings, worship, Bible studies. So the chance of any sort of violence in any congregational meeting per year is approximately 2.7 of a million meetings. Again, really small chance that there's any violence. The chance of gun violence, since gun violence is a minority of any sort of violence happening in a place of worship, the chance of gun violence, much in any place of worship, much less in any meeting, is so incalculably low. I'm not a mathematician. I couldn't even calculate that, but incredibly low. We talked about that, Reverend Halifax and I, and he agreed with me that the greater chance of something happening with guns in his church and any church was from what he said, stupid gun carrying congregants. And he told me an anecdote of a woman who, I suppose sort of proudly, or I don't know, sheepishly, whichever, shows her pastor that she too carries a gun, concealed carry. She carries it in her purse, and there they are in church, and she opens her purse and pulls out her handgun to show her pastor what she carries. And both of them are startled, realizing that she had been carrying her handgun in her purse, loaded and cocked with the safety off. A disaster just waiting to happen. And that statistically is much more likely to be what happens than any good guy with a gun, taking out some bad guy to protect the innocent. So my conclusions from the phenomenological research I did was, one, evangelical gun ownership, sometimes dutiful, sometimes fanatical, is a perplexing phenomenon. It seems to defy both what I understand to be Bible in regard to this, learning in part from colleagues like David May, but also seems to defy statistics relative to fear and to safety, and to actual risk versus perceived risk and fear. Secondly, my conclusion is these observations warrant further research and reflection. Why? Because for Christians, the stakes are high for getting it wrong about guns and God. So further research would be warranted, including quantitative research to check out in a quantitative, more generalizable fashion my beginning hypotheses, and others that were generated as a result of my research, including that the observed appeal of handguns is grounded in fear and idolatry. That's hypothesis. I can't prove that, but I'm reflecting on what I have observed in those particular sort of locations and experiences that I had. I wrote, the fear of God might incentivize worship of God or might incentivize worship of idols, from whom protection from harm is hoped. And I wonder, are handguns analogous to a golden calf? We can't see the God we say we worship. Perhaps we make idols that make us feel protected, even out of metal and wood. Another hypothesis that my research generated was that one way to make sense of the phenomena of evangelicalism and guns is to correlate gun culture with narcissism. Monty Wilson wrote an essay published online a few years ago. He said, modern American Christianity is filled with the spirit of narcissism. We are in love with ourselves. And if so, then justifying lethal self-protection and stand your ground laws really needs no explication or defense. If, in fact, what matters most is self-love and protection. So two more brief readings, because the other activity that I engaged in was shopping for research and then shopping for and buying a handgun, something I had never done before. I did not apply for a concealed carry permit in the state of Kansas, but I did go shopping for a handgun. It seemed important for a better understanding of the regulations that gun owners worry and complain about. It also seemed to me that there may be something psychologically impactful about owning and carrying a handgun, an effect I do not experience as the owner of a vintage rifle, the gift of an uncle stowed safely up on the family farm in Minnesota. As a boy, I also had purchased on my own, without a parent present, a shotgun for hunting. That was a long time ago. Purchasing a handgun was not a part of the research I was looking forward to, and my life partner definitely was less than thrilled. Handguns, after all, are not made primarily for hunters. Ultimately, I found a pawn shop dealer who offered me a used handgun belonging to his wife. He said it doesn't work or have all of its working parts because it had been stolen from my wife 20 years ago and the police just returned it as is. I'll sell it to you for $25 as is. Sold. That handgun worked just fine for purposes of research, for theological, ethical, and artistic purposes also. It is now the substance of an iconic cross fashioned with carved black walnut extenders. I have a gun, and I know how to use it.
Thank you, Terry, both for that presentation and for your excellent article that you wrote. So we're going to move forward to a little bit of discussion between Terry and David and I, and then open it up. So David, I wonder if you'd want to start out, if you have any comment or question that you have.
Sure. First of all, I want to commend my colleague, because so often we think about seminary professors or academicians living in an ivory tower, and Terry went out there. You went in the midst of the phenomenological approach, and I commend that. We are not all ivory tower folks, and Terry's a good example of that, so I appreciate that. One of your conclusions, or one of your hypotheses to explore a little further, got me intrigued. You mentioned that fear and idolatry seem to be major features for purchasing handguns. I'm just kind of curious, when you were in these experiences visiting with folks, did they ever come and share any kind of scriptural or theological foundation that would support buying, carrying, and using a gun? Did they say, here's a theological reason, or here's a scriptural reason that I feel like guns are something that I can have and use and buy and carry? Just curious.
Actually not. None of the research data I collected provided me that. In fact, I once had a seminarian who was also a gun-toting pastor, who wrote a paper for my class about an incident in their church in which there was suspicion of a couple who came in to a church meeting, and they were followed, and there were no guns ever shown, or no violence that they, it may have been profiling, frankly. But that's what the article was, the essay was about, and intimating that the writer of the essay, the seminarian pastor, also was carrying a gun, and felt like that was a good thing to do because of people like that who may pose a threat to the congregation. The paper, the assignment required that anything that was claimed have biblical and theological grounding, and it was totally lacking. So the writer did not get a good grade, and responded wanting to meet with me face to face to discuss the paper, which at this point, I actually had never experienced concern about meeting with the seminarian until then, because there was insistence on meeting face to face, not just in a phone call. And I thought this is one occasion where I really should have alerted security. I actually had the meeting on at my office at a medical school, and I thought I probably should have alerted security that someone may be coming on the campus carrying a weapon, and that there may be danger. There wasn't. We sat down, we had a conversation. I talked about that, but I never, and I acknowledged that this was really an awkward conversation, specifically because she carried a handgun. And I knew it now. And that this had gotten in the way of our relationship, which was a good relationship and had been. But I never did get any biblical or theological grounding for her claims that she ought to be carrying a gun. And I haven't yet. It doesn't mean that there isn't some out there.
So I have a question. As I was reading the description of the store with the guns next to the Bible and Bible verses and crosses, and people hearing Christian praise music while they're looking at AR-15 assault rifles, for me, there was just this jarring sense of contradictions. But it seems like those who are part of this culture, they don't seem to be experiencing that from what I gathered. It seems like maybe they're holding really strong values, but in separate compartments. Or I kind of wondered about that. So I was wondering, did you have a sense that their faith and theology were integrated with and supported their gun beliefs and practices? Or was it more that there was a compartmentalization in which people are keeping these conflicting beliefs and values that they have separate in order to avoid that discomfort of contradictions? It's kind of related to what David asked, but I was just wondering about, are they putting them together, or is it just kind of they're both out there but in contradictory compartments?
Yeah, so just reflecting on my own experience growing up in a household with guns and owning one still to this day, I felt no contradiction, but it was hunting rifles and shotguns. No one I knew owned a handgun, even thought about owning a handgun, much less an assault rifle. It just wasn't a thing. And so there was no compartmentalization. It was just rural life. Handguns, again, are not made for hunters. They're made for shooting other humans. And assault rifles, I don't know what they're made for other than war. So, you know, they are part and parcel of religious life, definitely. But I do sense some compartmentalization that on the one hand, there's Jesus and God, and we have our hymns and our prayers around that, and communion and baptism, and on the other hand, there's this other religious like zeal, this sort of enamored by, I think it is the power in my pistol, the power in my handgun, the power in this large automatic, semi-automatic rifle, that I think it's being enamored with power. But again, this is hypothetical, speculative. I'd have to interview a whole lot more people, survey a lot more people, and in controlled, trials, and I've not done that.
Well, I think maybe at this point, it might be good to look at the couple questions that have been in the chat. And if there's more time, David and I, of course, have more questions, so we can bring up to you. But we have from, actually kind of related to this, from Dean Manchurnock, I'm sorry if I'm not saying that right, talks about when values conflict between faith proposal and the value of gun for safety, and something they may not even understand. Where might we start a theological reflection with congregations? And fear and idolatry, those are some possibilities, but how could we start helping people theologically reflect on this conflict of values that they're living with? Any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts. Very pastorally, one might start by listening, right? What is it about your guns, your handgun, your multiple guns? What is it about that compels you? How do you relate to them? Maybe, sort of like the questions we started with. What is your relationship to those guns? I think I would start there. You and I, Ruth, were having a little discussion the other night. There's another part of me that says maybe it's evangelism. Maybe that is the response. If indeed this is idolatry, if this is another religion entirely with another God or set of gods, for whom we want protection, if we're taking that into our own hands, maybe it's preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and calling people to be born again.
Well, we have another question that came up from Michael Carter. What was Reverend Halifax's response to the story of what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane? So we're going to talk about some of those texts next week with Dr. David May. But was that part of your discussion at all with Reverend Halifax?
It was, and I think I write about it in the article, because he brought up a sort of trolley problem, which in ethics, Dr. Potter has used this many times, or maybe not. Some of us do and some of us don't use it, but the trolley problem is one where you're faced with, you have to do something and both options seem horrendous. either you run the trolley into 5 people who are on the tracks, or you turn off onto a side track where there's 1 person who will be killed, and you have to choose between the 5 or the 1 or something like that. And Reverend Halifax has come up with a sort of trolley problem where you've got a bad guy with a gun who is threatening an innocent, and you have the option of letting the bad guy kill the innocent person, or you can kill the bad guy. What ought you to do? And it seems sort of obvious to him that, of course, if you could kill the bad guy and protect the innocent, that's what you should do. So we talked about, again, the statistical likeliness that anything like that would happen, and that if it did happen, that the statistical likeliness that you would mess it up, and other people get hurt. But I said, Jesus already responded to this question, Ted, and it was in the garden, and he was the innocent, and the apostle or the disciple, had the gun, which was the sword, and he had the opportunity to protect the innocent by striking the bad guy. And Jesus' response was the answer you're asking me.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a response here in the chat. I think Jesus would want the bad guy to live, to have a chance to be saved, which is a good point there. With a gun.
Which is not to say that there might not be tragic circumstances in which someone actually is faced with that sort of an ethics dilemma. And I am not so arrogant as to claim that there isn't an exception to every rule, and that there may well be an exception to that rule that Jesus laid down. I hope never to have to face it, but other people in the world have had to, and I will not lay judgment on them for the choices that they made in truly tragic circumstances.
Yeah, the problem with carrying a gun is that becomes the response. The response that tends to come out is using it rather than some other possible options at times. So, well, we are already out of time here. There would be many more things we could discuss. We haven't had an open time for the audience, and I know David and I have more we could talk about, but fortunately we have 2 more sessions together. I do hope that all of you will come back next week at the same time, the same number, to part 2 of this series, where we have Dr. David May talking about his article and his perspective as a New Testament scholar. His article was The Sword Violence of Luke's Gospel. So it's going to get into some of that passage again that we were talking about, the Garden of Gethsemane. So please do plan to come back, and feel free in the meantime to read David's article. Maybe jot down a few questions that you have now that you've had this session and coming up to the biblical part. Biblical part's really, really important for us to get our heads around. So do encourage you to come back. I want to thank all of you for coming and being a part of this. I want to thank Terry for his excellent article and presentation, and David for your contributions on the panel. And I do hope each one of you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.